Good afternoon, everyone. We are the Group 4 and we are assigned to discuss about the economic situation, including the agrarian situation in the 19th century. Here is the outline of our topic. First, we are going to discuss about the economic background during the 19th century. Next, disputes due to the economic growth, economic changes made by Spain, and lastly, the historical values. It was on February 13, 1565, when the Spaniards colonized our country. With 4 ships and 380 men, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi arrives in the Philippines. It was on April 27, 1565, when the Spanish troops invaded the archipelago and attacked the defiant Raja Tupas, which is the son of Raja Humabon, making him sign an agreement after his defeat and effectively placing the Philippines under Spain. And on May 8, 1565, the island of Cebu is surrendered to Legazpi by its ruler, Raja Tupas. Then Legazpi establishes the first permanent Spanish settlement on Cebu and becomes the first Spanish Governor-General.
On to the economic background of the Philippines during the 19th century. The rise of nationalist movement in the late 19th century can hardly be possible without the economic growth in the Philippines after about 1830. In effect, this economic growth brought increasing prosperity to Filipino middle and upper classes who were in position to profit by it, as well as to the Western, chiefly British and American merchants who organized it. It also brought both machinery and common goods into the Philippines, which the industrialized economies of the West could supply, and that Spain could or would not supply. During the 19th century, the Philippines' economic condition gave rise to haciendas, or the cash crop economy. The country became a major exporter for these cash crops and became well known in other parts of the world. By these events, there was a shift from barter system to the moneyed economy. These are the figures for the Philippine foreign trade for the beginning, middle, and end of this period. With a steady increase in exports and imports, the country's total trade in 1825 amounted to 2,800,000 pesos, in 1875 31,100,000 pesos, and in 1895 62 million pesos. These figures were significant for the country's economic growth. Agricultural products were the exports of the Philippines during this flourishing economy. These products include rice, which the growing population demanded, as well as sugar and abaca. The places which controlled the large lands where these products were grown profited the most in these exports. These places include Central Luzon, Batangas, parts of the Bicol region, Negros, and Panay. Due to this, Filipino hacienderos, friar orders owning large haciendas, and inquilinos of the friar haciendas, or the leaseholders of the agricultural lands, profited the most. During this time, inquilinos were equivalently hacienderos in their own right, passing on from one generation to the next the lands they rented from friar hacienda and farming them by means of their shared tenants or kasama.
The topic that I am about to discuss is the disputes due to the economic growth during the 19th century. During the 19th century, there is a rising prosperity in the friar haciendas, which brought the friction between the inquilinos and hacienderos. Rising prosperity means that the lands in this period grew in value and the rents were also raised. A combination of traditional methods and modernizing efficiency led to these disputes, ultimately over who should reap the larger part of the fruits of the economic boom. This eventually led to the questioning of the friars' rights to the haciendas. To further understand the disputes, we have to have knowledge about the history of the friar lands. The existence of friar lands is traced back to the early Spanish colonial period when the Spanish conquistadors were awarded lands in the form of haciendas for their loyalty to the Spanish crown. Approximately 120 Spaniards were granted either large tracts of land called Sitio de Ganado Mayor or smaller tracts called caballerías. However, the hacienderos, those who owned the haciendas, failed to develop their lands, and one reason is that the Spaniards were not expected to permanently stay in the Philippines. Many of them returned to Spain once they were done serving in the country. Also, the livestock market during this time was still small. Thus, the galleon trade based in Manila appealed more to the Spaniards because it offered better economic opportunities. The Spanish friars were able to acquire land through whatever means available to them. According to sources, lands were donated to the friars in exchange for spiritual favors. So many Filipinos believed that the friars had no time to cultivate the land they owned because they acquired them through usurpations and other means. When the export of agricultural crops started to blossom in the 18th century, the inquilinato system was implemented. A person who rented land for a fixed annual amount, an inquilino, was expected to give personal services to the landlords. If he or she failed to do so, he or she would be expelled from the land. The inquilinos could also lease the land they were renting from the landlord to a kasama or sharecropper who would then be responsible for cultivating the land. The inquilinato system functioned as a three-layered system, with the landlords on top, the inquilinos in the middle, and the kasamas at. We shall now talk about the Hacienda de Calamba dispute. A brief background. The Hacienda de Calamba was originally owned by a Spaniard who donated the land to Jesuit friars to allow him to permanently stay in the Jesuit monastery. However, since the Jesuits were expelled from the Philippines, the hacienda went to the possession of the Spanish colonial government, and in 1803, the land was sold to Don Clemente de Azanza. After his death, it was eventually sold to the Dominicans who claimed ownership of the hacienda until late 19th century. Rizal's family became one of the principal inquilinos of the haciendas. They rented one of the largest leased parcel of land, measuring approximately 380 hectares. The main crop was sugarcane since it was the most in demand in the world market. The Rizal family got their income mainly from the land they rented. The conflict rose from the continued unreasonable increase of rentals, confiscation, and other exploitative practices of the hacienda management. This caused financial hardships to the tenants and was worsened by other factors, mainly having poor harvest and the destruction of crops due to unfavorable weather and pestilence. The beleaguered tenants of Calamba asked Rizal to conduct an investigation regarding the controversial fertile lands owned by the Dominican friars in relation to the agricultural problem that pitted the tenants against the wealthy, powerful owners. The results of the investigation suggest that these haciendas of the Dominican order compromised not just the lands around Calamba but also the town of Calamba too. The profits of the Dominican order continued its increase because of the arbitrary increase of the rentals being paid by tenants. However, though the increase in profits, the hacienda owner never contributed a single centavo for the celebration of the town fiesta, education of the children, and lastly to the improvement of the agriculture. The tenants who spent most of their time in labor for clearing the lands were dispossessed or evicted of the said land for flimsy reasons. High rates of interest were charged for delayed payment of rentals, and when the rentals can't be paid, the hacienda management confiscated their carabaos, tools, and homes. With Rizal's exposure to the problem, he gained such important materials which he used as sources that enriched the sequel of his novel, El Filibusterismo. Rizal's story on Cabezang Tales and his findings on the agrarian conflict in Calamba in 1887 brought to the fore the exploitative agrarian setup created by the vast friar estates. The friar haciendas became the source of oppression, poverty, and peasant discontentment that led to armed revolt that challenged the Spanish colonial structures. Rizal knew very well that agrarian conflict could ignite a national revolution.
Again, good afternoon everyone, and let us now proceed to the economic changes made by Spain during the 19th century. Let's start with the Bandala system. So in this system, Filipinos were required or forced to sell their agricultural harvest to the government. Whether they like it or not, they need it or not, they have to sell them to the government in exchange for a piece of paper containing a promise to pay or what we call the promissory note. So this system was imposed to increase the funds for wars against other European explorers. Another was the new way of land ownership. The Spain introduced the idea that a person and his family owns a land. The land was divided among the rich Haciendas, religious orders, and others. Religious orders, mainly Dominic and Augustine, became owners of vast tracts of friar land, which was leased to natives and mestizos, and rich landowners can pass their lands to their heirs. Next is the encomienda. An encomienda is a land ownership system with the use of titulo as proof of ownership. So the introduction of the concept of legal title to land that is private ownership, or the titulo, is the most significant Spanish innovation concerning the property rights. During the Spanish colonial period, lands were divided and granted to encourage Spanish settlers or reward soldiers who served the crown. So it was given by the king to a Spanish conquistador as a reward. And in 1591, there were 267 encomiendas in the Philippines. The landlords are called encomendero, and they are required the right to collect tributes from the natives. And that tributes soon become land rents, and the people living within the boundaries of the encomienda became tenants. Encomiendas were granted in exchange of defending the land from external attack, maintain peace and order within, and support the tasks of the missionaries. So yung mga encomenderos, sila yung first hacendados in the country. Next is tribute. Tribute was a residence tax during Spanish times. So Filipinos were compelled to pay tribute called tributo to the colonial government. This was imposed as a sign of the Filipinos' loyalty to the King of Spain, and those who paid tribute were individuals between 16 to 60 years old. Each family pays 1 peso per year. The tribute was replaced in 1884 by the cedula tax. Other forms of payment includes gold, chickens, textile, cotton, and rice. Then again, Filipinos were unhappy with these taxes because Spanish officials cheated and oppressed them. Next is the polo. Since elementary, nababanggit na sa atin to ang polo or forced labor, also called polo y servicios. So in this, all male Filipinos from 16 to 60 years old were forced to work for the government for 40 days. The pulista work for various public works. Ang pulista, yun yung mga workers, and they are obligated to do construction of buildings, churches, cutting trees to make logs. So this labor was for 40 days a year, and they are supposed to be paid 1/4 reals. A pulista could get out of this work by paying a sum of money, hiring somebody else to do his polo. Also, the members of the Principalia or the town aristocracy were exempted from the polo. Next is the abolition of slavery. So in 16th century, the Spanish missionaries protested to the king about keeping of slaves in the Philippines. As a result, a royal decree was made in 1598 to abolish slavery in the country. Next is the tobacco monopoly. In 1782, economic program of Spanish Governor General Jose V. Basco, in which tobacco production in the Philippines was under total control of the government. So yung tobacco, itinanim siya sa mga probinsya ng Ilocos, Cagayan, tapos Nueva Ecija. Tapos sa mga lugar ngayon, walang pwedeng itanim kundi tobacco lang. Yung Spanish dictated where to plant the tobaccos, how much to harvest, and how much to pay the farmers. It lasted for 100 years, from 1781 to 1881. Next is the galleon trade, also known as the Manila-Acapulco trade. So, this trading was done between Manila and Acapulco, Mexico. This was a government monopoly that lasted for 250 years. Yung mga galleons, they carried spices, porcelain, ivory, and silk na binibenta sa Mexico. So yung trip to Mexico lasted for 200 days and the return trip lasted for 20 days. And of course, only the elite can benefit from this trade. The person who has a boleta is allowed to engage in the galleon trade. Yung boleta, yun yung ticket that entitles a person to ship goods to Mexico. And yung traders who do not have enough money to buy a boleta will borrow money from Spanish friars. So it ended on 1815 when Mexico revolted against Spain. Another is the opening of Suez Canal. So it was built on November 17, 1896. It connects Mediterranean and Red Sea, shortened distance between Europe and Orient. It also enabled the Philippines to have direct commercial relations with Spain instead of through Mexico via the galleon trade. And with the shorter travel time to Spain, it enabled more Filipinos to study in Europe, mostly in Madrid and Barcelona. Next is the introduction of new plants and animals. So, Spanish colonizers introduced new plants and animals in the Philippines, and plants including corn, coffee, cacao beans, and etc. Animals also includes sheep, cattle, goats, and pigeons.
Another change made by the Spaniards is the introduction of new industries. Spanish taught the Filipinos better methods of farming, cattle ranching, the making of candles and soap, etc. They also constructed stone houses, built roads, bridges, and dams. They also introduced how to weave mats and hats. Filipinos began to grow large amounts of sugar, hemp, coconut, and tobacco. Later, these industries became the pillars of the Philippine economy. Next is the Economic Society and the Royal Company. These two economic organizations were introduced by the Spaniards. The first one is the Economic Society of Friends of the Country. It was founded in 1781 by Governor-General Basco, and it stopped its operations on 1809. It is established for the advancement of agriculture in the country. It existed only in the Spanish era, and General Basco developed the Philippine agriculture the most. It sent the first shipment of indigo dye to Europe. This organization bought birds from China to fight locusts that destroy the crops. This organization also imported seeds and machinery from United States to help the farmers. Next is the Royal Company of the Philippines. It was founded in 1785 by King Charles III. It was hardly managed and it closed down in 1834. King Charles took advantage of the trade and shipping industries. This is owned by the king, foreign banks, private citizens in Spain, Mexico, Cuba, the Philippines, and other Spanish colonies. It is established for the promotion of direct trade between the Spain and the Philippines. Another change is the scientific survey. The first scientific survey of the Philippines was done by Spaniards under the command of Captain Alejandro Malaspina in 1789. A botanist, Antonio Pineda, went with the expedition. Two ships sailed across the archipelago and explored the coasts. From this expedition came the first modern shipping chart and map of the Philippines. World trade and foreign investment. In 1834, Spain opened the Philippines to world trade. Goods are imported and exported in the Philippines, and this new policy improved the Philippine economy. Goods from the Philippines could be shipped out to any countries abroad, and goods from other countries could enter the Philippines directly. They did not apply to Chinese settlers, but it covered other white men. In the early 19th century, foreign businessmen were allowed to do business in Manila and other places in the country. American and European traders came and opened new businesses in the Philippines. One of the most significant changes introduced by Spain is the rise of the banks. Religious orders and rich Spaniards gave loans to businessmen, and the interest was used for charitable works. This was called Obras Pias, or the good work system. The first Filipino bank was founded at Manila in 1830 by Francisco Rodriguez, but the bank no longer exists. Francisco Rodriguez was a Filipino Quaker or a Protestant who lived in England. The Bank of the Philippine Islands, or BPI, was the oldest existing bank in the Philippines. It started as Banco Espanyol Filipino. The picture on the left is the oldest branch of BPI, which is located in Iloilo. In 1862, Mont de Piedad Savings Bank was also founded by the Spaniards. The Spaniards also improved the transportation and communication. Transportation and communication in the Philippines improved greatly in the 19th century. Spain built roads and bridges, lighthouses, the first city tramcar, and the first electric light system. The first telegraph started in 1783. The first steamships came in 1848. The first postage stamp was issued on February 1, 1854, wherein in 1854, the first monthly mail from Manila to Hong Kong also started. Then, the first telephone came in 1890. We were also introduced to the social classes. The three social classes are the upper class, middle class, and lower class. The upper class are composed of the richest and the most powerful people in the society. They were also called as principalias or ilustrados. They were the former datus, maharlikas, or nobles. From this class came the local officials like Gobernadorcillo and Cabeza de Barangay. Next is the middle class, which are newly rich people owning lands, business, or worked as professionals. The richest of the middle class could also become ilustrados, professionals, and landowners. Rizal, Aguinaldo, and the Luna brothers also came from this class. Lastly, the lower class, which includes workers and tenants farmers. Out of this class came the heroes like Bonifacio, Emilio Jacinto, and Diego Silang. The last change introduced by the Spaniards are the prizes and exhibition. Prizes were given by the Spanish officials to encourage farmers, investors, artists, and scholars. Example of this is in 1853, a Filipino inventor won 2,000 and a gold medal for a machine to clean hemp fibers. The Economic Society of Friends of the Country gave special prizes to planters and investors.
For the historical values of economic situation during the 19th century, these are the observations we have seen. Number 1. Despite the flourishing economy, our country's natural resources and wealth were not developed by Spain. They just export our natural resources and wealth back to Spain and to other countries. Number 2. The Spaniards benefited the most from the nation's wealth, and rich Filipinos copied their arrogant snobbishness and aristocratic ways. They seemed to become parasites of our countrymen, and worse, the rich Filipinos themselves has copied the arrogant snobbishness and unfavorable ways for the lower class fellow men. Number 3. There was a little development under Spain in land ownership. This was due to the unfavorable treatment of these colonizers and the system they had brought to our country. All the favors are for them and for the higher class. We have been treated as slaves. The reason as well is that due to the little to none privilege of education to the Filipinos, which we all know the colonizers also has the control. However, number 4, the oppression of the Filipinos by Spaniards and the rich caused unhappiness which led to revolution. Yet, until 1898, freedom was at last proclaimed. Filipino heroes shed their blood for this revolution. Also, a great part was contributed by our national hero, Dr. Rizal, in this revolutionary awakening. So that would be all for the historical values of economic situation during the 19th century. Thanks for listening.